Wow, look at this room. It is fantastic, huh? Have everybody here to talk about women power and leadership. It is a conversation with our cherished guest, Claire Shipman, who is very well known to all of us. She has been in the public arena for years, television journalist for NBC, ABC, and CNN, and we are running out of alphabet, Claire. She covered historic global events, among them something that impacted my life tremendously, the fall of the Soviet Union. And she has many, many prizes, well earned. Emmy, Peabody, DuPont Awards, just to mention a few. Very important for the conversation today is that she has invested a lot of thought in the topic we would be discussing. She has 2 New York Times bestseller books. Womenomics, I love this title, Claire. Work less, achieve more, live better. And the second one, The Confidence Code, The Science and Art of Self-Assurance, What Women Should Know. She co-authored these 2 books with Kathy Kay, another very famous, superb journalist. They have teamed up again for their latest book, The Power Code, More Joy, Less Ego. Maximum impact for women and everyone. And their timing could have not been better. We are at a point in our history when we see some pushback on equality, on the role of women in our societies. And this tremendous progress we have achieved cannot possibly be given away. I think that when we look at the high corridors of power, we still see there more men than women. And yet, as I often say, if we want to live in a peaceful world, please bring the women up. So it is interesting to hear from Claire, because women don't seek power the same way men do. And when they have power, they use it differently. So we have to understand it and then define it for the benefit of all, both women and men. The conversation with Claire would be led by our own fabulous Sabine Batia. Sabine has also been redefining women power. She is our Deputy Secretary at the IMF, and what she did was, years ago, to launch IMF Inspired, with the goal to bring fresh female perspectives in the annual meetings. So please join me in welcoming Claire Shipman and Sabine for a conversation today.
Thank you very much, Kristalina, for your very kind remarks. And let me also extend a very warm welcome to you, Claire. We are delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
And a warm welcome to our audience here and online. It's great to see so many people on the first day of our annual meetings. So, Claire, I wonder whether you remember 10 years ago you were here at the IMF to discuss the Confidence Code.
Yes.
A lot has happened since then. There's been the Me Too movement, the pandemic, and many other transformational events that I think have had an impact on women in particular. But before we delve into those, I want to ask Claire about herself. So Claire, tell me, you've had an amazing career as a journalist. You've covered many hotspots, Moscow, Washington. So talk to us about your experiences and what prompted you to look into women power leadership. questions.
Great question, Sabina. Thank you. Thank you for having me again. I love the IMF. Thank you, Kristalina. It was such an honor to be here. Kristalina helped us with our book, and we profile her in the book. When I start to think about my career, I realize how old I am, so there's a little bit of angst associated with that. But I think that I started to look into women in leadership in the context of my career. Probably it was all born of frustration, right? Like so many of the greatest innovations and things that happen. And at every level, I think when Katty and I wrote Womenomics, we were trying to have families and careers, and we've sort of hit up against some of the things so many women do, and we just, decided to write about the economics of women at work and women in the bottom line. I think confidence was something else we noticed as we were working on that topic, and then power has really been something that we've observed for a long time, and we think is, there's some structural issues we need to look at with power, which I know we'll talk about. But I spent years as a young journalist abroad, which was really formative for me. I spent 5 years living in Moscow and traveling all around Eastern Europe as everything changed. And then I spent a lot of years covering the White House and U.S. politics. And yes, I think Washington is now indeed the hot spot that Moscow used to be. And it was an exciting career in a lot of ways because I got to observe so much. And I love to observe power dynamics, politics, human relationships. But it's interesting. I think what I've learned now is, and when I look back on my career, and especially as regards power, I had a number of moments in my career that I think really were an example of the ways in which I did not fit into the traditional power structure, and that I sort of rubbed up against a power structure that I think was, created by men, largely for men, and I didn't understand it at the time because I was so young. But I wonder for the women in the audience if they might recognize some of these things. I remember being in a heated discussion about where we should be putting our camera crews during the coup against Gorbachev, and at the time I was, I had studied Russian studies. I was getting a lot of good reviews for my reporting. I was really new on the air, but I was, had some opinions, and I knew what I was talking about. And it was the executives who had all flown in. It was as though my voice was sort of white noise, I think, right? Like they were not hearing me. And at one point, somebody told me, I don't know how many women have been told this, that I needed to calm down.
Oh.
Now, at the time, right, I was 25. So I took that, and I was like, well, I didn't cry. I wasn't yelling. I really didn't understand it. I also didn't understand it was wrong and offensive. And I assumed I was just doing something wrong. So, of course, I learned to work through the male producer in our office and make sure that things were happening the right way because people were listening to him. I got back to Washington, and over my years covering politics, it was a series of sort of, you'll sound better if you have a deeper voice. We have a coach who can work with you on that. Have you thought about getting Botox for the frown you have between your, the way you ask questions is not gotcha enough. You need to really play gotcha journalism, and you're too kind in the way you interview people. Your interview style's all wrong. One time, right before going on air, I had somebody yell in my ear, really right before my live shot, as we called it, lose the scarf, Shipman. Like that was the most important. And just for the record, I still have scarf PTSD. I really can't wear scarves. I didn't really like Botox. I guess maybe I like to frown. And I think most importantly, though, I learned after about 10 years in the business that my style of conducting journalism and interviewing people actually worked well, right? But it took a long time to figure that out. And now, with all this reporting we've done on power, I started to see I just was bumping up against a kind of power structure that wasn't made for me. But I spent a lot of years believing it was me, right? And I had to just figure this out.
No, in fact, your stories and all your books are just so amazing, because when we look at you and Katty Kim, and then I look at it and say, wow, if this is how you feel, it sort of validated what a lot of us have felt. And we always thought, oh, well, it's just us, especially when you're young, right? You think it's always me. I'm not assertive enough. You've got to be more assertive. You've got to speak up. Well, how about everyone giving you the space to speak up, right? So a lot of what you said resonated. So I want to talk a little bit about your new book, The Power Code, which Kristalina mentioned.
It looks nice with your shirt.
That's a coincidence. But it's an amazing book, and you offer a fascinating study of the differences between women and men in terms of how we think about power, how we look at it, how we aspire to it or not, how we use it. So share with us your insights on the study.
Can I say something first? Because I am so grateful to have so many men in this room. And it's really, and we have a whole chapter in our book on men. And some of the things I'm going to say, I just want to note, men are eager for change too. And I'm going to get there, but I'm just really grateful to have everybody listening to this. When we, as I mentioned, we were sort of wondering why, after writing so many books about women in leadership, we're like, things aren't changing, right? The data, they are into middle management, but the numbers for women at the very top are so stagnant. And we started to look at some of these, inconsistencies we saw in the study of power, in whether women even want power, what they think of it. And what we really uncovered was something pretty fundamental, and that is that women tend to define power quite differently than men do. Women tend to think about power to. Men tend, and I'm really boiling this down here, but men tend to think about power over. And that's a really fundamental difference, it turns out. And the power over is sort of based on you can imagine, a very hierarchical system, right? And what's really interesting, when we started to dig into just definitionally power, who studies power, what's the academic study of power like, right? It's heavily at business schools, but also sociology. And the field of power and the study of it's a couple hundred years old. And the classic definition, right, is sort of like, A has power over B. If A can get B to do something B doesn't want to do. That's power, right? And that's sort of like, well, it's not very much fun being B, but that is a kind of classic hierarchical definition of power. But what we found is really interesting that's happening, is that so many more women now, female academics, are studying power, and just in their look at power, the definition of what power is and the questions that are being asked are entirely different. And they're seeing that women don't tend to think about power as a zero-sum game as much, right? They want to ask why, what for. There's a motivational aspect to wielding power that is very important to women. And that has created, I think, in our view, a real clash sometimes, especially, with what I was describing, I experienced or women experienced. There's also a lot of interesting research we came across that women often reject power outright. Some really interesting academic studies, especially at Harvard, by the incredible researcher Alison Wood Brooks, who found that women have many, many more life goals than men have. And many of those life goals they see in conflict with today's power, right? So they don't value above everything else, for example, having head count reporting to me, right? There's a list of these. And they have so many other things they value, whether it's time with friends and family, taking care of family members, taking care of community. Men, for the moment, have a narrower set in her studies that she's done over and over again of life goals, and power tends to rate more highly at the top of those. So this was sort of a classic theme that runs through our book in unpacking, the fact that we are operating in a structure that was created in one way, a structure we think really needs change. We don't just by declaring it, it's not going to happen overnight. But I think for a lot of women, understanding that it's, again, like you said, Sabina, it's not me, right? I'm in a system that doesn't fit. So now what am I going to do about that?
Right. But I do think the workplace is changing. I know you talk about less ego, more joy.
Yeah.
And I think the younger generations are changing. So when I mean, look at the IMF itself, compared to like 20 years ago, when it was much, much more hierarchical, right? A lot more ego, more of power over. Now, I think with the younger generation, it's tending to become a bit flatter.
Yes.
So some of that. Do you find that too in your research?
Well, it is.
With the millennials
Yes.
now taking on managerial roles, Gen Z joining the workforce, they don't have a lot of patience for hierarchy.
There's much less of a gender gap in the younger generations in terms of what they want and value. So that is interesting. I will also say at the IMF, right, you've had 2 incredible female leaders in a row, and your data is not like the data of most organizations in the world. It's exceptional and it's fantastic, right? But yes, things are changing. It's just not always as quickly as we had thought. But what's interesting to watch is how are they changing, right? This flattening of a hierarchy. When we looked around, we picked, as I mentioned, we profiled Kristalina in our book. We wanted to find women who've navigated the classic power structure, right? And look at what are they doing. So we looked at what Kristalina's doing, right? And it's a lot about, women tend to promote women tend to promote diversity, but also there was this really interesting focus here on, so I describe it, I boil it down to sort of taking the fear out of management, right? There's not as much, there was less tolerance for sort of bullying and just being a jerk around power, if you will. We looked at Zanny Minton-Beddoes, who's the first female editor of The Economist, right? She's a huge focus on collaboration, less hierarchy, meetings that are open to everybody. We looked at Sent Marshall, who runs the Dallas Mavericks, an incredible CEO for them. Big focus on authenticity at work, right? So there are we started to find these key pieces that female leaders bring that are pretty unique and extraordinary and transformational of an organization. But we still need more women at the top.
Exactly. So, power can be a good thing, right? Because you can use it to,
yes,
achieve useful goals. So I'm just wondering, why is it that we are seeing so little progress of women in leadership positions? If you look at Fortune 500 companies, only 10% of them are headed by women. Yeah. Worldwide, a little over a quarter of parliamentarians are women. Heads of state and government, out of 200 countries, we have how many? Maybe 25. Yep. So is it that we're lacking in ambition, or is it that there are just not enough opportunities? What's going on, and what more needs to be done? Because I feel we've been having this conversation now for several years. Right? So what else needs to be done?
I agree with you. And sometimes, Katty and I had such writer's block as we started to write this book, because we're like, wait, some of these issues are just the same. Like, we're writing about work-life balance again, and, 20 years later. I think that, look, it's a combination of things, right? Is there bias in the workplace? Yes, right? As I mentioned, are women often opting out of a power structure that they think doesn't fit their values? Yes, they are, right? And is there a problem with the fact that women want a sort of more value-based power system that doesn't exist, a power to? We have to think about that. Confidence that we wrote about is also part of it, right? There's a big element here of fitting into this power structure and risk-taking and confidence for women that we really think is important to focus on. So I don't want to take away from the fact that there is still bias. There are things we need to do to change that. But what I think is so interesting is there's a gap. Right? One of the leadership experts we talked to said she does these studies often. And if you ask a group of people, what do they think about? Who do they think of as a leader? Usually it's the familiar archetype. They name a man, right? But if you ask who do they admire, it's much more often a woman. It's a Mother Teresa. It's their own mother. It's their grandmother. It's a so there's a gap between what they see as a leader and who they want to be. And I think about this kind of gap with the data that we have on the workplace, right? And leadership. All of the best attributes of leaders really are, they're male, but heavily female as well, right? The collaboration, less hierarchy, listening, like the things that women bring are universally valued in leaders. the data that is done over and over again for the last 20 years, more women in senior management means more profitable enterprises that work better, right? So there's an economic argument for this. There's a leadership argument. But I think that there's just a systemic problem when it comes to the highest levels of power, when it's that white noise problem again. It's sort of, well, you know, she's not quite charismatic enough, ambitious enough. There's almost a reversion to the old standards. And that's what we really tried to dig into in a couple, you know, chapters of this book. Like, what are the most important holdups here? And we found some really interesting studies, for example, about one big retail giant had a grid that measured performance in managers versus potential. Mm-hmm. And the performance, right, was the women who they were studying outperformed the men. But the potential and the labels they used to measure that were things like assertiveness, ambition, confidence, right? The women did not rate as highly. So very often they weren't promoted, or, you know, maybe they were. But then the second round, they would go back and look at the same women, and they had actually then outperformed the men they were measured against the first time, right? So there's just this bias that exists, but it's also about, it's almost about the labels we use, right? And needing to sort of ask ourselves, how can we disrupt the things that we've always used to measure whether somebody is a leader and what a leader looks like? And that's much, you know, it's a challenge. It's much more subtle stuff than kind of a flexible workplace.
Right. And so also a lot of unconscious bias going on.
Yeah, of
as well.
course.
Yeah. But I want to ask you about something that's been very much in the news, and that's DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's been a backlash against it. We're seeing it on universities, we're seeing it in corporations. And it's a very complex subject, and we can't get into all the dimensions of it to do it full justice. But I wonder if you could speak to, I mean, what I worry about is whether this backlash is going to hinder our ability to get women into those leadership positions. You know, what your thoughts on that?
I worry about that too. I mean, we are in a moment of backlash in so many ways, and a highly political moment, and people are angry and frustrated and want to use a lot of these phrases as just cudgels to beat up political opponents and to score points. I think, and I've thought about this a lot with our work, I think that the way forward has to always be focused on data, because the data is there and the data doesn't lie. You know, more healthy companies, I was just talking to a fintech company about this. I mean, healthy companies and companies that do better than their competitors have more women in senior leadership. They have more diversity in senior leadership, right? The tremendous professor at the University of Michigan, a math professor, sort of created a math equation about this, right? You have, you know, diverse thinking leads to better outcomes. And that's not just that women are bringing more than men are. It's that people of different backgrounds, people of different races, people of different ethnicity, right? That's what you want in decision making. And so I think making sure to ground everything in the data and not about, is this morally right or wrong, right? I think that is, we're in this highly politicized moment about, and everybody wants to declare they know best about what is right and wrong. And I think the way forward is to leave that argument aside, focus, of course, on qualifications, but you know, we have to look at the bottom line of what we want in terms of healthy enterprises and good decision making.
Yeah, so it has to be grounded that in business, it makes a lot of economic sense to have a diverse workforce. I mean, we have that here at the IMF. We're an international organization, and so we have, as our staff, people from all over the world. And obviously, we need to trying to get to gender parity simply because our counterparts are, you know, we need to look like our counterparts. We need to resonate. Our arguments need to resonate with them. So actually on that, I want to ask you a little bit about sort of cultural issues, because, as I said, we're an international organization of 100. We just got 191st member today, Liechtenstein.
Congratulations.
Right? And so And so women are from all over the world. I'm from India. And so in addition to differences between men and women and differences, generational differences, there are also differences amongst us in terms of our history, our culture, norms, expectations, including of ourselves. And I'm wondering if you and Kathy have looked at those issues.
We did. We looked at those issues as regards. Sorry, I need the glasses, but then the lights are.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. We looked at them as regards confidence, and for example, and there are interesting confidence differences in different societies, right? So and it really has to do with confidence. It has to do with the propensity for risk taking, because that is what ultimately drives the creation of confidence. And so we found that societies that were less prone to risk-taking often, as a whole, right, exhibited less confidence. And then you can imagine if you're a woman in that society, right, it may be a double burden. For power, it was interesting. Of course, whether or not women can achieve power, there's gender parity. I mean, of course, that it depends on the societal system in place. And so we know that some are more open to movement than others. I think what was really interesting for us was the data on what motivates women and this issue of power too, and women wanting to ask why. That, when we looked at the data and did interviews with women around the world, was something we all as women have in common. Right? The female parliamentarian we interviewed in Senegal, who's heavily focused on toilets for girls in schools so that girls can go to school and have their periods and not have to stay home and miss an enormous amount. I mean, that's how she defined power, and she made that a hallmark, right, of her. And I think when we looked around the world at women seeking this kind of why to power, that's a commonality. And I think it's important to think about as organizations everywhere think about how do we not just change organizations to welcome women, but how do we motivate women to want to seek power as well, and to understand that you can do incredible things with power. I mean, I'm sure Kristalina would agree, right? It's a thrill if you really have it and you can do things with it.
Right. So we really need to motivate women to be change makers, bring about that change, right?
Well, and see it differently.
See it differently as well. As a positive thing, not something to shy away from.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to change gears a bit and talk about your earlier work, Womenomics, where you talked about, and you mentioned this, more flexible workplace, etc., and how, 15 years ago, women were arguing for more flexibility because they were doing a lot of the child rearing, they had different values, and workplaces changed in response because it made sense. It was good for the bottom line and to retain talent. We ourselves at the IMF are much more flexible now in terms of work. And then came the pandemic, and the pandemic, of course, completely transformed the way we work. So 15 years on, I want to ask you, what's your take on Womenomics? What's your advice to women and men? And the reason I ask this question, and I'm not sure everyone here knows this, even from the IMF, that actually 1/3 of our workforce has been hired since the pandemic. That's a large number. So just your take on this.
Well, I mean, Womenomics, when we wrote it, was really an argument. We were trying to get everybody familiar with the data, and women especially, that I've said now 10 times because I love it so much, that the more women you have at the top, right, the better the bottom line is, to help women understand the actual natural power that they have, but also shine a light on the fact that many times women will need a bit more flexibility at certain points in their lives and careers, and that was possible. It was interesting because we looked at all these studies at the time on working remotely, and would it work, would it not work, and how would you measure productivity? Well, of course, the pandemic was the biggest study we ever could have asked for in terms of remote work. And I think it's interesting. We're swinging back. You've probably seen, right? We're swinging back a little bit now. There are a lot of employers in New York and on the coast saying, we want you back 5 days a week. We don't like flexibility anymore. But I think what we have achieved now is an understanding that remote work, it's possible to be productive remotely. That is possible. What I don't think we've figured out as a society is the cultural piece, right? There's a, the culture of workplace is important, right? You need to have time together and in person in order to create a culture that is something people want to belong to and really will drive an enterprise in a positive way. And it's really important for younger workers as well. So I think we're seeing a bit of swinging on that, and we'll probably land someplace where there's some amount of flexibility, but we've been able to test it. I will say that I don't think we've solved I don't think we've fully solved work-life balance because, we have a whole chapter in our book or a section on greedy work. And in fact, the fact that, now that you can work anywhere and everywhere and all the time, right, a lot of people expect that. And work never ends. And that is an issue that we have. And I'll just add that, we don't have to talk about it now, but we have a whole chapter on partnerships and marriage and work and dividing things, and it's complicated, right? That is a piece that has to be solved, I think, for human beings in order to figure out what time we're going to devote to work, but also to community and, things outside of work that require an equal amount of attention.
Yeah, my takeaway from that chapter was choose wisely in order to get good work-life balance, right?
Are you gonna ask me about men, or I want to dive in with a point about men?
You can, absolutely. We have so many men in the audience, and I'm very happy about that. And yes absolutely. Well, let's talk about how we can bring men as part of the conversation. We need to be, and I do want to say this about men, the IMF, that really we have wonderful mentors, supporters, and promoters of women.
Yes.
And a lot of senior men here, leadership of the IMF, sitting here in the front row, shout out to them. And they have been incredibly supportive of women. So.
Well, when we set out to do this book, I think we thought, well, yeah, the power, we don't have power yet. Why not? Well, clearly men are just wanting to keep it, and, this is really frustrating. We started doing all this reporting, and I have to say that the chapter on men is really eye-opening. So when I talk, this power to, power over, I think what we really uncovered is men aren't really happy with the way power is used today, or it affects them at work either, or even the men, which was especially painful for us to interview, who were trying to do things differently. Many of whom were trying to sort of take time off, stay at home, support their partners or their wives, and were really stereotyped in ways that were particularly cruel and difficult. I mean, one man said to us, I feel that I have failed at the one thing in life I was supposed to do well by not sort of having a certain kind of provider image, and fulfilling that for my family. So I think in some ways the stereotyping around men and being able to make different choices and decisions it's really rigid right now. And that's something we have to focus on, I think, in order to kind of have a blend of this, at least power to versus power over. And I think, with so many of the women we interviewed in really tough, tense corporate jobs, different settings, the advice that kept coming back was, we have to be able to talk openly about issues and not assume people have bad intentions. And so many men I speak with are sort of like, I don't know how to talk about this. I'm afraid to talk about it. I don't want to offend anybody, but I'd like to be able to say something like X, Y, Z. So I really would just encourage everybody to approach, sometimes these really difficult situations that might feel frustrating to women with an attitude that, we have to be generous as well in our interpretation of motives, I think.
Absolutely. No, I think that's very well said. But actually men also want a different sort of workplace and work-life balance, and they also... It's quite challenging to have these discussions for them as well. Well put. So we're running out of time, so our last question, I don't want us to end thinking that the glass is half empty. I know we have a long way to go, but we have come a long way. Many organizations have women as the head of the organization, our own, the IMF. We've had a woman at the helm for over a decade, first Christine Lagarde. for 8 years, followed by Kristalina, who's just completed her first 5-year term and is embarking on her second 5-year term. Shout out. Yeah. So from where you sit, Claire, how do you see the impact of their leadership on the IMF and on the world?
Well, I think, look, you definitely don't have to be glass half empty here. So this is a terrific organization and a really interesting, I think, interesting role model for other organizations, because you've had, two fabulous female leaders in a row. And they both have made incredible change, and their dedication to this sort of equity is really, the impact of that is profound. But also having 2 women in a row in itself is not insignificant, right? Because one woman often seems like, well, we tried that, now let's get back to, what we're used to. and I think in so many different ways, when you look at just bias and expectations, and right, you're sort of wanting to just normalize what different leadership feels like. And I think, just the impact of that in an organization like the IMF that's, that the world watches, and the impact on the world, it's huge. I would say that the other thing that I observe about what's happened at the IMF, and I'm by no means an expert, so forgive me, but much in the same way that I said when you have the women who are studying power in business schools redefining power just because it's their gaze, right? This female gaze on power, and it's broadening the definition. I think you're seeing that at the IMF in terms of the mission of the IMF and the focus and what has driven, what's behind a lot of the decisions that have been made. I mean, we were talking earlier about what happened during COVID, and that just a sense of the IMF is less a sort of uptight fiscal, just a little bit more human and understanding really what is called for in a moment. And that's profound, right? That you're seeing an impact here, but worldwide in terms of what organizations like the IMF can do. So there's a lot to be excited about. We want more, right? We want more Kristalinas and more sort of this diversity of thought and leadership. I really think it's going to help us, if we can do that, get through this really polarized state that the world is in right now.
Okay, well, thank you for that. That seems a good note to end on. A human face for the IMF. Yes, we love that. So thank you very much, Claire, for sharing your thoughts with us. Please give Claire a big round of applause. And we would love to have you back here again, and let's not make it another 10 years. Okay? Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And enjoy the meeting. Yeah.